Close your eyes and picture a Roman arena fighter. You probably see a hero, a mountain of muscle, standing defiant in the center of the great amphitheater, fighting for honor and glory. A man who chose his destiny, adored by the crowds. This is the image movies have sold us for decades. It's a powerful image, full of romance and rebellion, the ultimate symbol of strength against tyranny. A slave who could win his freedom with the edge of his sword. But like most things that seem too good to be true, this popular image is almost entirely wrong. The truth is much darker, much stranger, and far more miserable. The life of a real arena fighter was not a Hollywood epic. It was a short, brutal, and often humiliating existence. Tonight, we're going to pull back the curtain on the myth and see the grim reality. We are going to walk through the real experience, step by agonizing step. We'll explore why almost no one chose this life, what they were forced to eat, and how the games were often rigged from the very start. This is the story of why being an arena fighter truly sucked. Forget the heroic speeches and the epic one-on-one duels for a moment. The journey into the arena began not with a choice, but with a terrible misfortune. It was a path forged from the worst possible circumstances life could throw at you in the ancient world. So let's begin where it all started, not with a dream of glory, but with the loss of everything. The first step to becoming a fighter wasn't walking into a gym. It was being captured, condemned, or sold. It was the ultimate dead-end job. The vast majority of these fighters were not volunteers. They were human beings who had been stripped of their freedom and their rights. They were seen by the Roman state not as people, but as raw materials for entertainment, like clay to be molded for a bloody spectacle. Think of a soldier from a tribe Rome had just conquered. One day you are defending your home. The next, you are in chains, marched hundreds of miles to a city you've never seen. This was a primary source for the arena. Prisoners of war, strong and already trained to fight. Another pipeline to the arena was slavery. A slave who was troublesome or simply unlucky could be sold by his master to a school owner. Imagine being sold like a piece of furniture, knowing your only future was to fight and die for someone else's profit. Then there were the criminals. In Rome, certain crimes were met with a sentence to the fighting schools. This was a death sentence, but one that would be drawn out and monetized for the entertainment of the masses. You wouldn't just die, you'd die on schedule. Now you might have heard of the volunteers, the ones who chose this life. They were real, but they were a tiny, desperate fraction of the total. These men were free Roman citizens who, for their own reasons, signed a contract to become fighters in the arena. But why would any free person do this? The reasons were almost always grim. These were men crushed by massive debt, former soldiers with no other skills, or social outcasts with nothing left to lose. They weren't seeking glory. They were running from something far worse. Signing the contract was a deeply serious and humiliating act. The volunteer would swear an oath to his new owner. He agreed to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword. He was willingly signing away his legal status as a human being. In exchange, he might get a signing bonus that could pay off his debts or feed his family. But with that money came a new identity. He was no longer a citizen. He was disgraced on the same legal and social level as a prostitute or an actor. So the choice to become an arena fighter was never really a choice at all. It was the illusion of a choice, presented to people who had no other options left. It was a last resort, a final, desperate gamble in a life that had already gone horribly wrong. This is the first and most important truth to understand. The men in the arena were not there because they wanted to be. They were trapped. They were property. Their lives were dictated by a system that saw them as nothing more than performers in a state-sponsored bloodbath. Once you were acquired, whether as a prisoner, a slave, or a desperate volunteer, your journey took you to a fighting school. This wasn't a school in any sense we would recognize. It was, for all intents and purposes, a maximum security prison. The man who ran this prison was the school owner. He was the owner, the trainer, and the warden. He was often a former fighter himself, a man who had survived the life and now profited from the suffering of others. He held absolute power over his men. Life inside the fighting school was a monotonous cycle of brutal training, poor living conditions, and constant simmering fear. The goal was not to build heroes. The goal was to shape profitable assets, to turn a human being into a predictable and entertaining killing machine. This was your new home, a place of stone walls, iron bars, and the constant sound of weapons striking shields. Your life before was over. The only thing that mattered now was surviving until your first match in the sand, a day you both dreaded and, in a strange way, looked forward to. Let's talk about your new accommodations in the fighting school. You wouldn't be given a comfortable room to rest and recover. Instead, you were housed in small, cramped cells, often no bigger than a modern closet. These cells were arranged around a central training yard, meaning there was no escape from the sights and sounds of your grim profession. The cells were bare, with a simple straw pallet on the floor for a bed. Privacy was a concept that simply did not exist. You were under constant watch, not just by guards, but by the school owner and his staff. This was by design. It prevented plots, crushed any hope of escape, and constantly reminded you that you were not a person but a prisoner, a piece of property whose only value lay in your ability to perform in the arena. Your every moment was controlled. The daily routine inside the fighting school was designed to break you down and build you back up into what the owner needed. The day began at dawn, not with a gentle wake-up call, but with the harsh reality of training. The regimen was relentless and mind-numbingly repetitive. You would start with basic conditioning, running, lifting weights made of stone or lead, and practicing footwork until your legs burned. Then you would move on to weapon practice. But you didn't start with real steel. New recruits were forced to train with a heavy wooden sword that was often twice the weight of a real sword. The idea was to build immense strength and stamina, so that when you finally held a real weapon, it would feel light as a feather. The training was a form of brutal, constant pressure, meant to weed out the weak and instill absolute obedience. Discipline within the fighting school was swift, brutal, and absolute. The school owner held the power of life and death over you, and he never let you forget it. Any sign of insubordination, laziness, or defiance was met with severe punishment. This could range from whippings and beatings to being chained to a wall or put on starvation rations. The message was clear: your body was not your own. It belonged to your owner, and he could do with it as he pleased. The fear of this punishment was a constant companion, a ghost that haunted every training session and every sleepless night. This system of control was designed to strip away your individuality, your pride, and your hope, leaving only a trained response to violence. You learned to obey without question, because the alternative was immediate and agonizing pain. Now let's talk about the diet. Forget the modern idea of an athlete's diet, full of lean protein and carefully balanced nutrients. The fighter's diet was cheap, simple, and designed for a very specific purpose that had little to do with peak physical fitness. The core of their food intake was carbohydrates. They ate massive amounts of barley, beans, and other grains, often cooked into a thick, bland porridge or stew. They were sometimes called barley eaters, as an insult, highlighting their low status. This carb-heavy diet wasn't meant to carve them into chiseled specimens. It was meant to fatten them up. A thick layer of subcutaneous fat provided an extra layer of protection over muscles and nerves, cushioning non-lethal cuts and making the fights last longer and appear bloodier for the crowd. Imagine eating the same tasteless, mushy meal day after day. The food was fuel, and nothing more. It was about caloric intake in the cheapest way possible. While they might have received some vegetables or a bit of dried fruit, meat was an extreme rarity, a luxury they would almost never see. The purpose of this diet was purely economic. The school owner was running a business, and he needed to feed his assets as cheaply as possible while still making them functional for the arena. The result was a physique that was not the lean, muscular ideal we see in movies. Real arena fighters were likely bulky, powerful men, but with a layer of fat that served as a kind of built-in armor. It was a diet of survival, not of champions, and another constant reminder of their low standing in the Roman world. One of the most surprising things about the life of an arena fighter was the quality of medical care. In a world with no concept of germs or modern surgery, these fighters had access to some of the best doctors of their time. The famous physician Galen, for example, spent part of his early career as a doctor at a fighting school. But this care did not come from a place of compassion. It came from a place of cold, hard economics. A trained fighter was an incredibly valuable investment. A school owner might spend a small fortune to buy and train a promising man. To have that fighter die from an infected wound or a poorly set bone was a terrible loss of profit. So doctors were employed not to ease suffering, but to protect the asset. They became experts in treating sword wounds, broken bones, and all the grisly injuries that came with the job. The treatments these doctors performed were often as brutal as the injuries themselves. Without anesthesia, setting a broken bone or stitching a deep gash was an exercise in agony. Surgeons would probe wounds with long metal instruments to remove bone fragments or pieces of dirt, all while the fighter was fully conscious. They developed complex techniques for managing wounds, using things like honey as an antiseptic and clean linen for bandages. They were pioneers in trauma care, but their patients were unwilling participants in these medical experiments. Surviving a fight was only half the battle. Surviving the recovery was another ordeal entirely. You might be saved from death, but you would be patched up only to be sent back into the sand to risk it all over again, carrying the scars of your last ordeal. Let's move on to the equipment. The armor and weapons of an arena fighter were not designed with fairness or even maximum protection in mind. They were designed for spectacle. Each type of fighter, including the rare female ones, was a specialist, equipped in a very specific and often bizarre way. The goal was to create visually interesting matchups between men with different strengths and weaknesses. Think of it like a game of rock, paper, scissors, but with deadly weapons. For example, the heavily armored, fish-crested fighter with his large shield and sword was often pitted against the man who fought with only a net, a trident, and a dagger. This created a dramatic contrast: the slow, powerful tank versus the quick, nimble fighter. It was a carefully engineered piece of theater. The famous fighter helmets were iconic, but they were also instruments of sensory deprivation. They were often heavy, completely enclosed, and had only small eye holes for vision. Imagine the experience of wearing one. Your field of view would be reduced to a narrow slit, and your hearing would be muffled by the thick bronze. The sound of your own panicked breathing would be deafening inside the metal shell. It was disorienting and claustrophobic. This was part of the show. The helmet dehumanized the fighter, turning him into a mysterious, monstrous figure. It also made the fight more dangerous and unpredictable, as the man's senses were severely impaired. It looked impressive to the crowd, but for the man inside, it was a terrifying handicap that added another layer of difficulty to an already impossible task. The weapons themselves were real and deadly, but they weren't always the high-quality, perfectly balanced swords you might imagine. They were tools of the trade, and like any tools, they varied in quality. The primary short sword designed for stabbing was a staple, but other fighters used a variety of weapons: tridents, spears, daggers, and even lassos. The combinations were dictated by tradition and the need for a good show. The armor was often deliberately mismatched. A fighter might have a huge shoulder guard but no armor on his chest. He might have a greave protecting one leg but not the other. This selective armoring was designed to leave parts of the body deliberately exposed, creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited for a dramatic and bloody finish. Let's talk about the different classes of fighter, because the variety is where the calculated cruelty of the games becomes clear. One of the most famous types was the Chaser. He was heavily armored with a large shield, a sword, and a distinctive smooth helmet with 2 tiny eye holes. He was specifically designed to fight the net fighter. The chaser's smooth helmet was designed so that the net would slide off, but the tiny eye holes made him practically blind and prone to overheating. The entire matchup was a piece of theatrical engineering. The slow, powerful chaser would relentlessly pursue the fast, lightly armored net fighter around the arena. It was a contest of stamina versus speed, a deadly dance choreographed for the pleasure of the audience. Then there was the net fighter himself, perhaps the most vulnerable and unusual of all fighter types. He fought with almost no armor, save for a shoulder guard and sometimes a loincloth. His weapons were those of a fisherman, a weighted net to entangle his opponent, a sharp trident to stab from a distance, and a small dagger for close-quarters combat. His strategy was to keep moving, to tire out his heavily armored opponent, and to wait for the perfect moment to cast his net. If his one shot with the net failed, he was left incredibly exposed, armed only with a long, unwieldy trident against a swordsman. The crowd loved the net fighter for his speed and agility, but his chances of survival were often slim. He was the underdog by design, a fighter whose entire existence was a high-stakes gamble. Consider the Greek-style fighter, who was styled after a Greek soldier. He carried a small, round shield, a spear, and a sword. He was more heavily armored than the net fighter, but his small shield offered limited protection compared to the large, rectangular shields of other classes. He was often pitted against the classic Roman-style legionary fighter. This created a symbolic clash of civilizations in the arena. Greece versus Rome played out for entertainment, but for the men involved, it was a life-or-death struggle, dictated by their equipment. The Greek-style fighter had to rely on his spear to keep the swordsman at a distance, knowing that if his opponent closed the gap, his small shield would be a poor defense against the powerful sword. Another bizarre and terrifying type was the chariot fighter. These men fought from chariots, like ancient Celtic warriors. They would ride into the arena, often in pairs, armed with spears and swords. The spectacle of a chariot battle must have been incredible for the audience, a chaotic whirl of horses, wheels, and weapons. But imagine the skill and courage it took to control a speeding chariot, manage a team of horses, and fight an opponent at the same time. The danger of a crash, of being thrown from the chariot and trampled, was immense. The chariot fighter was less a duelist and more a daredevil, a performer in a high-speed demolition derby, where the slightest mistake meant a gruesome death under the hooves of horses and the wheels of his own vehicle. Perhaps the strangest of all were the blindfolded fighters. These were not a standard class, but a special type of performer for the games. These men were forced to fight each other while wearing helmets that had no eye holes at all. They were completely blind. They would be released into the arena and would have to stumble around, listening for the sounds of their opponent, swinging their swords wildly in the hope of making contact. This was not a contest of skill. It was a terrifying and morbid comedy for the crowd. The audience would roar with laughter as the blindfolded fighters flailed at each other, bumping into the walls and missing by wide margins. For the men inside the helmets, it was the stuff of nightmares, a fight against an unseen enemy in total darkness. The day of the games was the culmination of all this training and suffering, but it didn't begin with a glorious entrance. It began with an opening procession. The fighters would be dressed in elaborate, colorful robes and paraded through the streets and into the arena. This was a chance for the crowd to see them up close, to pick their favorites and place their bets. But for the fighter, it was a deeply humiliating experience. You were being shown off like a prize animal, an object of spectacle. You could see the faces in the crowd, the excitement, the bloodlust. You knew that many of these people were there to watch you die, and they would cheer when it happened. It was a stark reminder of your status as a disposable entertainer. Before the main events, the arena would often be warmed up with preliminary shows. These could include animal hunts, where armed men would fight exotic beasts brought from the far corners of the empire, like lions, bears, and crocodiles. More grimly, the morning was often reserved for public executions. Condemned criminals, not trained fighters, would be brought into the arena to be killed in gruesome and theatrical ways. They might be thrown to wild animals, burned alive, or forced to reenact scenes from mythology that ended in their real deaths. This brutal opening act served to whip the crowd into a frenzy and numb them to the violence that was to come. For the fighters waiting in the tunnels below, the roars of the crowd and the screams of the dying were a terrifying preview of their own possible fate. When it was finally time for the main contest to begin, you would wait in the dark, cramped tunnels beneath the arena floor. These tunnels were the waiting pens, a kind of prison. The air would be thick with the smell of sweat, fear, sand, and blood from the morning's events. You could hear the roar of tens of thousands of people above you, a deafening wave of sound that vibrated through the stone. This was the moment of truth. All the brutal training, the terrible food, the constant fear had led to this. An official would read out the pairings for the day. You would hear your name called, and the name of the man you were about to fight. He might be someone you trained with, someone you ate with. But in the arena, he was your enemy, and only one of you might walk out alive. The fight itself was rarely the noble one-on-one duel to the death that we imagine. While some fights were, the reality was more varied and often more cynical. Fights were managed by a referee who could pause the action or even stop the fight if it was not going well. The school owner and the sponsor of the games wanted a good show. A quick, boring fight was bad for business. Sometimes, fights were even scripted. Two fighters might be instructed to put on a dramatic but non-lethal performance, a piece of choreography designed to thrill the crowd without risking valuable assets. But you could never be sure. A scripted fight could turn real in an instant if one of the fighters made a mistake or if the crowd demanded blood. The myth that all fights ended in death is one of the biggest misconceptions. In reality, a trained fighter was a huge investment. It was far more economical for a school owner to have his man survive to fight another day. Most contests did not end with a death in the arena. A fighter who was defeated could appeal for mercy. He would drop his weapon and shield and raise a single finger, a gesture of submission to the sponsor of the games. The sponsor would then typically look to the crowd. The crowd would signal with their hands and voices whether they wanted the loser to live, to be spared, or die. The famous thumbs down gesture is likely a myth. Many historians believe a different hand signal signified death, while a hidden thumb or a waved cloth signified mercy. Receiving mercy was not the end of the story. If you were spared, you were considered defeated. You would leave the arena in shame. Your value as a fighter diminished. You would be patched up by the doctors and sent back to the fighting school to train for the next fight, carrying the psychological burden of your defeat. Your life was spared, but your ordeal was not over. In some ways, this was a crueler fate than a quick death. It was a cycle of violence, fear, and temporary relief, with the promise of more violence to come. You live to die another day, your fate always in the hands of others, your owner, the referee, the sponsor, and the bloodthirsty whims of the crowd. While death was not the outcome of every fight, it was a constant and very real possibility. Some fights were advertised as being, quote, without mercy. In these brutal contests, the fight would go on until one man was dead. There was no appeal, no chance of survival for the loser. These were the most high stakes and terrifying of all matches, often reserved for the most important festivals or for condemned criminals whose death was already a foregone conclusion. Going into a fight without mercy meant accepting that this was likely your last day on Earth. The psychological pressure must have been unbearable, knowing that the only way out of the arena was to kill the man standing opposite you. Let's talk about the idea of fame. It's true that some arena fighters became massive celebrities. They were the sports superstars of their day. Their names were household words. Graffiti on walls in Pompeii praises certain fighters. Their images were used on pottery, lamps, and mosaics. Children played with fighter action figures made of clay. Some famous fighters even had fan clubs and attracted wealthy female admirers who saw them as symbols of masculine power. A star fighter could be a huge earner for his owner and a symbol of pride for his city. This is the part of the life that seems appealing, the part that fuels the Hollywood myth. But this fame was a gilded cage. It did not change the fundamental reality of a fighter's existence. No matter how famous you became, you were still legally a disgraced person without rights, at the very bottom of the social ladder. You were still a slave, or a condemned man, the property of your owner. Your fame was the fame of a prized racehorse, or a champion fighting dog. You were admired for your physical prowess and your ability to create a spectacle, but you were not respected as a human being. Your admirers would cheer for you one day and cheer for your death the next. The fame was hollow, a temporary distraction from the grim truth that your life was not your own. The groupies and wealthy admirers are another part of the myth. While there is some evidence that fighters had female fans, the idea of them living a life of romantic conquest is largely exaggerated. They lived in a prison, under constant guard. Their opportunities for social interaction were severely limited. Any relationship would have been at the discretion of the school owner, who controlled every aspect of their lives. The admiration they received was from a distance, the fantasy of people who saw them not as complex individuals, but as symbols of violence and raw masculinity. It was a fame that objectified them, turning their bodies and their deadly skills into a commodity to be consumed by the public. The ultimate goal for any arena fighter, the dream that kept them going through the pain and fear, was freedom. It was possible, but incredibly rare, to win your freedom from the arena. A fighter who had survived many fights and had become a crowd favorite could, if he was exceptionally lucky, be awarded a symbolic wooden sword. This was a representation of the wooden sword used in training. Receiving this special sword meant you were officially discharged. You were a free man. You could walk out of the fighting school and never have to fight again. This was the moment every fighter dreamed of, the ultimate prize in a game where the stakes were life and death. But what did freedom actually mean for a retired fighter? Life on the outside was not easy. You were free, but you were forever marked by your past. You carried the physical scars of your career on your body. More than that, you carried the psychological trauma of everything you had seen and done. You were still socially tainted by your time as a disgraced person. Many struggled to find a place in normal society. Some used their unique skills to become trainers in a fighting school, perpetuating the same system that had enslaved them. Others might become bodyguards for wealthy Romans. But a quiet, peaceful retirement was likely out of reach for most. The arena left a permanent stain on a man, one that could not be washed away by a simple wooden sword. The vast majority of arena fighters never saw freedom. They never held the wooden sword of release. The statistics are grim. Most historians estimate that the average career of a fighter was short, perhaps only a few years. Many died in their very first fight. The constant risk of injury, infection, and death in the arena meant that the turnover rate was incredibly high. The fighting schools were constantly in need of new recruits to replace the men who had fallen. For every famous fighter who survived to retirement, there were hundreds, perhaps thousands, who died anonymously in the sand, their names forgotten, their lives reduced to a brief, violent spectacle for the entertainment of others. The dream of freedom was, for most, just that, a dream. Let's consider the psychological toll of this life. Imagine the constant state of fear and anxiety. Every day, you lived with the knowledge that your life could end violently at any moment. You trained alongside men you would later be forced to kill. Friendships must have been complex and fraught with peril. How could you form a bond with someone when you knew that one day the success of your own life might depend on ending his? This created a deeply isolating and paranoid existence. The mental stress, the post-traumatic stress, must have been overwhelming. We have no written accounts from fighters themselves, but we can only imagine the nightmares that haunted them in their small, dark cells. The system was designed to dehumanize them, to turn them into objects. The exotic, often frightening helmets hid their faces, making them anonymous figures of violence. The crowd didn't cheer for Marcus or Gaius. They cheered for the chaser or the fish-crested fighter. This anonymity made it easier for the audience to enjoy the spectacle without guilt. It also reinforced the fighter's own sense of worthlessness. He was not a person with a history, a family, and feelings. He was a role, a costume, a performer whose only purpose was to bleed and die for the approval of strangers. This stripping away of identity was one of the cruelest aspects of the entire institution. So when we look back at the Roman arena fighter, we should see not a muscle-bound hero from a movie poster. We should see a human being caught in a brutal and exploitative system. We should see a prisoner of war fighting in a bizarre costume that impairs his vision. We should see a man fattened on barley, not feasting like a king. We should see a slave whose life is a commodity to be bought and sold, and whose fame is just a brand name for a disposable product. The reality of the arena fighter is a story of survival against all odds, in a world that was designed to kill them for sport. The entire spectacle of the games served a powerful purpose for the Roman state. It was a form of social control. The games were a distraction, a way for the ruling class to keep the masses happy and occupied. The slogan was, "Bread and circuses. Give the people free food and spectacular entertainment, and they will not rebel." The violence in the arena also served as a stark reminder of the power of the Roman Empire. It showed what happened to enemies of the state and criminals. It was a demonstration of absolute authority, a way of saying we have the power of life and death, and we can turn it into a party. The next time you see a film or a show that glorifies the arena fighter, remember the man behind the helmet. Remember his journey from capture or condemnation. Remember his life in the prison-like fighting school, his diet of bland porridge, and the constant fear that was his daily companion. The story of the fighter is not a story of glory. It is a story of human suffering packaged as entertainment. It's a sobering reminder that the most popular spectacles in history are often built on a foundation of profound misery. The cheering of the crowd in the great amphitheater was the sound of a system that had successfully turned human life into a cheap thrill. The world of the arena fighter was a complex ecosystem of exploitation. At the top was the sponsor, the wealthy politician or emperor who paid for the games to win public favor. He paid for everything, from acquiring the fighters to renting the venue. Below him was the school owner, the businessman who ran the training school. He was the middleman, profiting from the buying, training, and leasing of human bodies. And at the very bottom was the fighter himself, the product being consumed. He was the one who took all the risks, who bled in the sand, but he saw the least reward. It was a brutal pyramid scheme where the value flowed upwards, away from the man whose life was on the line. We must also remember the sheer scale of this enterprise. The great amphitheater in Rome could hold over 50,000 spectators, and it was just one of hundreds of arenas scattered across the Roman Empire. The demand for fighters and exotic animals was enormous, fueling a vast network of trade and logistics. This was not a small-scale, back-alley operation. It was a state-sanctioned, empire-wide industry of death. For centuries, this cycle of capture, training, and combat was a central feature of Roman life. It was as normal to them as professional sports are to us today, a fact that is perhaps as chilling as any individual fight. The legacy of the arena fighter is a strange one. We have romanticized the very thing that made his life a living hell. We celebrate the image of the lone warrior defying an empire, when the reality was that he was a cog in the empire's machine of control. The truth is that being a Roman fighter sucked not because the fights were hard, but because every single aspect of your life was built on a foundation of powerlessness, humiliation, and the cold, calculated business of death, The greatest battle the fighter fought was not against his opponent in the arena. It was against a system that was determined to erase his humanity. Let's revisit the fighting school and the social dynamics within it. While it was a prison, it was also a unique and intense community. The men inside were all living under the same death sentence. This must have created powerful, if complicated, bonds. They were rivals, but they were also brothers in suffering. They would have shared stories of their former lives, offered comfort, and taught each other survival tricks. These relationships, however, were always shadowed by the grim reality that the man you shared your meal with today could be the man you were forced to kill tomorrow. This paradox must have created a profound sense of isolation, even within a group of people who understood your situation perfectly. The hierarchy within the fighting school was also very pronounced. It was a microcosm of the Roman world, with its own strict social ladder. A veteran fighter, a top-ranked man who had survived many fights, would have commanded immense respect and authority among the other men. He was living proof that survival was possible. He would have better privileges, perhaps better food or slightly better living conditions. The new recruits were at the very bottom. They were hazed, tested, and molded by the veterans and trainers. Survival in the school meant not just learning to fight, but learning to navigate this complex and dangerous social world, where a wrong word could earn you a beating from a guard or a veteran. Let's consider the role of religion and superstition in a fighter's life. Faced with constant uncertainty and death, these men would have clung to any belief that offered a sliver of hope or control. Many fighters were from different parts of the empire, and they would have brought their own gods and rituals with them. We have archaeological evidence of good luck charms and amulets found in fighter barracks. They would have made vows to gods of war or fortune, praying for strength, courage, and above all, survival. These private rituals were a small act of defiance, a way to maintain a piece of their own identity and hope in a system designed to strip them of both. The end of a fighter's life was often as unceremonious as its beginning. If you were killed in the arena, your body was not treated with respect. Attendants dressed as the mythical ferrymen of the underworld would prod your body with a hot iron to ensure you were truly dead. Then, your corpse would be dragged unceremoniously out of the arena through the gate of death. You were not given a proper burial. The bodies of fallen fighters were typically thrown into mass graves or pits, without a marker or a name. You were a piece of trash to be disposed of, your purpose served. This final act of disrespect was the ultimate confirmation of your status in Roman society, a disposable object, forgotten the moment the show was over. The contrast between the romantic myth and the grim reality is starkest when we consider the simple, sensory details of a fighter's life. Imagine the smell of the fighting school, a mixture of sweat, unwashed bodies, blood, and cheap food. Imagine the constant noise, the clang of wooden swords, the shouts of trainers, the groans of injured men. Imagine the texture of the coarse wool of your tunic, the cold stone of your cell floor, and the oppressive weight of the training helmet on your head. This was not a life of heroic poses and dramatic speeches. It was a life of physical discomfort and grinding misery, punctuated by moments of sheer terror in the arena. Let's think about the armor again, not just as a tool, but as a symbol. The equipment, the weapons and armor, and the oath a volunteer took bound him to it. A free Roman soldier who lost his weapons in battle was a disgrace. For a fighter, his weapons and armor were a symbol of his enslavement. They were not his own. They belonged to the school owner. They were the tools of his trade, but also the very emblems of his servitude. When he put on that helmet and picked up that sword, he was no longer a person. He was a category, a type, a performer, ready to play his assigned role in a deadly play. The armor that was supposed to protect him was also a cage. The financial aspect of being an arena fighter is also deeply misunderstood. While a star fighter could earn prize money for a victory, he did not get to keep most of it. A significant portion, if not all, went directly to his owner. The fighter was the talent, but the owner was the one who reaped the financial rewards. A fighter might receive a small portion as a bonus, but it was hardly enough to buy his freedom. The system was designed to keep him dependent and in debt to his owner, ensuring he had no choice but to continue fighting. Any money he earned was just enough to give him a taste of a better life, a fleeting illusion to keep him motivated. What about fighting against animals in the hunts? While this was typically the job of a different class of fighter who specialized in it, sometimes regular fighters were forced to participate. Imagine being pushed into the arena, armed with only a spear, to face a hungry lion or a massive bear. These were wild, unpredictable creatures, and the fights were often chaotic and gruesome. This wasn't a test of martial skill. It was a desperate struggle for survival against the raw power of nature. It was another way the games provided novel and bloody entertainment, using the fighter as bait in a spectacle of man versus beast, with the odds heavily stacked in the beast's favor. The role of the emperor in the games was paramount, especially in the city of Rome. The emperor was the ultimate sponsor, the chief benefactor of the games. The great amphitheater was a stage for him to display his generosity and power to the people. An emperor like Trajan famously held games that lasted for over 120 days, involving thousands of fighters to celebrate a military victory. The fighter's fate in the arena in Rome was often in the emperor's hands. His gesture could mean the difference between life and death. The fighter was, in this sense, a pawn in the grand political theater of the Roman Empire. His life, a tiny detail in the emperor's public relations strategy. The very architecture of the amphitheater was designed to maximize the fighter's misery and the crowd's enjoyment. The elliptical shape of the arena ensured that there were no corners to hide in. The sand on the floor was there to soak up blood, making the evidence of carnage easy to clean up for the next event. The tiers of seating rose steeply, giving every spectator a clear view of the action. And deep below the arena floor, a complex network of tunnels and elevators allowed for dramatic entrances of fighters and animals, as if they were appearing from the underworld itself. The building was a perfectly engineered machine for death and spectacle. Let's talk about the idea of a good death. For a Roman, dying bravely was incredibly important. For a fighter, a good death was part of the job description. If you were defeated and the crowd called for your death, you were expected to accept your fate without begging or crying out. The proper way to die was to kneel and offer your neck to your opponent, meeting your end with stoic courage. This was considered the final part of your performance. A fighter who died bravely would earn the respect of the crowd. A fighter who showed fear would die in disgrace. Even in their final moments, they were expected to put on a good show. The fighting system slowly faded as the Roman Empire changed. The rise of Christianity was a major factor. The new religion, with its emphasis on the sanctity of life and its condemnation of public murder, was fundamentally opposed to the games. Christian emperors began to restrict the practice. The economic decline of the empire also played a huge role. The games were incredibly expensive to put on, and as the empire's fortunes waned, it became harder to justify the enormous cost of staging these massive spectacles. The last known contest in Rome took place in the early 5th century, bringing an end to centuries of ritualized slaughter. So when we strip away the layers of myth, what are we left with? We are left with a story of systematic oppression. The arena fighter was a product of a society that had a very different view of human life, entertainment, and justice than we do today. His life was not one of adventure and glory, but one of brutal routine, constant fear, and the overwhelming probability of a violent and anonymous death. He was a slave forced to perform in the most dangerous theater ever conceived. His story is a powerful testament to the human will to survive, even in the most hopeless of circumstances. The allure of the arena fighter myth persists because it speaks to a fantasy of individual power. We want to believe that one person, through strength and courage, can overcome impossible odds and win their freedom. But the true history teaches a different lesson. It teaches us about the power of systems, about how societies can normalize brutality, and about how human beings can be reduced to mere objects for the entertainment of others. It's a much darker and more complex story, but it is also a more honest one. The real fighter was not a superhero, he was a victim. Let's consider the training weapons in more detail. The weighted wooden sword was a tool of pure torment. Imagine spending hours every day swinging a weapon that is deliberately heavier than a real one. Your muscles would scream in protest, your joints would ache, and your entire body would be pushed to the point of exhaustion. This wasn't just about building strength, it was about instilling discipline through pain. It was a constant reminder that your body was being reshaped for a purpose that was not your own. The trainers would watch for any sign of weakness, any faltering, and would be quick with a lash or a sharp word to force you to continue. Every training session was a battle against your own physical limits. Another key piece of training equipment was the wooden post, about 6 feet high, that was fixed in the ground of the training yard. This was the fighter's silent opponent. For hours on end, a recruit would attack the post, practicing his footwork, his strikes, his blocks, and his parries. He would learn the precise angles of attack, the most efficient ways to use his shield, and the rhythm of combat. The post never tired, never made a mistake, and never gave up. It was a relentless teacher, and the fighter's progress was measured by his ability to master this stationary foe. It was monotonous, grueling work, the lonely and unglamorous foundation upon which a fighter's deadly skills were built. Let's try to grasp the sheer numbers. During the peak of the Roman Empire, it's estimated that tens of thousands of men were living and dying as arena fighters at any given time. The games held by Emperor Trajan to celebrate his victory in Dacia involved over 10,000 fighters over a period of 123 days. This means that on average, more than 80 fighters were in combat every single day for 4 months straight. The logistics of housing, feeding, and managing such a vast number of men is mind-boggling. It underscores that this was not a niche spectacle, but a massive, state-supported industry that consumed human lives on an industrial scale. The sand of the arena was constantly being replenished, not just with sand, but with fresh bodies. The legal status of a fighter, being disgraced, had very practical and humiliating consequences beyond just social stigma. A disgraced person could not vote, could not hold public office, and could not represent themselves in a court of law. They could not make a valid will. Their testimony in court was considered unreliable. They were, in the eyes of Roman law, fundamentally untrustworthy and morally corrupt. This meant that even if a fighter was somehow wronged, cheated by his owner, or assaulted, he had virtually no legal recourse. He was outside the protection of the law. This legal powerlessness was the foundation of his exploitation, ensuring that he could be treated as property with no fear of repercussion. Imagine the sounds of the arena from the fighter's perspective. It wouldn't just be the roar of the crowd, it would be a confusing and terrifying symphony of noise. The blare of trumpets signaling the start of a match, the rhythmic chanting of the crowd, baying for blood, the clash of metal on metal, the splintering of wood, the wet, sickening sound of a blade finding its mark, and above all, the sounds of men in pain, grunts of effort, shouts of aggression, and screams of agony. Inside a helmet, these sounds would be distorted and amplified, mixing with the sound of your own heart pounding in your ears. It was a sensory overload designed to induce panic and terror. Let's think about the different types of arenas. While the one in Rome is the most famous, amphitheaters were built all over the empire, from Britain to Syria. Some were massive stone structures, while others were more modest wooden arenas. Some, like the one at Pompeii, are incredibly well preserved and give us a tangible sense of the space. Walking into one of these silent ruins today is a haunting experience. You can stand in the center of the arena, on the very spot where men fought and died, and look up at the empty tiers of seats. You can almost feel the ghosts of the past, the faint echo of the roar of the crowd, and the profound sadness of what took place there. There were even female arena fighters. They were a rarity and were treated as a novelty item for the crowd. They often fought each other, sometimes in recreations of mythological battles involving Amazon warriors. Evidence for them is scarce but undeniable, coming from ancient texts and a single tombstone found in Britain for two female fighters named Amazonia and Achillea. However, they were not seen as serious warriors. They were a bizarre spectacle, a way for a sponsor to show off and provide something new and exotic to a crowd that was perhaps growing jaded with the usual male-on-male combat. Their existence was another example of the Roman need to turn everything, even women fighting, into a form of sensational entertainment. The concept of retirement for a freed fighter could be perilous. While some might have found work as trainers, their fame and combat skills could also make them a target. In a violent society like Rome, a man known for his ability to kill could be seen as a threat or a useful tool. A retired fighter might be hired as a bodyguard or an enforcer by a wealthy politician or a criminal gang. This would plunge him right back into a world of violence, just without the rules of the arena. Freedom did not necessarily mean peace. It could simply mean a transition from organized, state-sanctioned violence to the chaotic and unpredictable violence of the streets. The sand of the arena is a powerful symbol. It's the very word from which we get arena. Its purpose was practical, to absorb the blood and other fluids spilled during the contests, making cleanup easier. After a day of games, the blood-soaked sand would be raked and sometimes even replaced. This act of cleaning the slate is deeply symbolic. It represents how easily the human cost of the games was erased. The suffering and death of the fighters were wiped away, leaving a fresh, clean surface for the next day's spectacle. The men were as disposable as the sand they fought on. Their lives were written in blood and then quickly erased. Let's dive deeper into the mindset of the free man who volunteered. It's easy to dismiss him as foolish, but we must understand the sheer desperation that would lead to such a choice. In a world with no social safety net, no bankruptcy protection, and no unemployment benefits, debt was a terrifying trap. A free citizen could lose everything: his land, his home, his social standing. Facing starvation or slavery for himself and his family, the fighter's oath might have seemed like the only way out. It was a trade, his body and his legal rights, in exchange for a chance to survive. It was a choice made at the absolute rock bottom of life, a gamble taken by a man with nothing left to lose. The relationship between a fighter and his school owner was one of the most complex in the Roman world. On one hand, the owner was his master, his enslaver, a man who profited from his potential death. He was a figure of absolute authority and fear. On the other hand, the owner had a vested interest in keeping his fighter alive and healthy. He would invest in his training, his food, and his medical care. A successful fighter brought wealth and prestige to the owner. This created a strange, toxic dependency. The fighter had to rely on the man who exploited him for his very survival. It was a relationship built on a foundation of mutual need and profound power imbalance. Let's consider the wild animal hunts in more detail. This was a massive industry. The Roman state went to enormous expense to capture and transport thousands of exotic animals from the farthest reaches of the empire. Lions from Mesopotamia, leopards from Africa, bears from Scotland, crocodiles from Egypt. These animals would be kept in cages beneath the arena and then released to be hunted and killed for sport. This was a way for Rome to display its vast power, to show that its dominion extended over the entire known world, including the animal kingdom. The slaughter of these beautiful, rare creatures was just as much a part of the spectacle as the man-on-man combat. The mock naval battles were the most extravagant and costly of all the Roman spectacles. These were staged on artificial lakes or in flooded amphitheaters. Thousands of men, often prisoners of war or condemned criminals, would be forced to board ships and reenact famous naval battles, fighting to the death. The scale was epic, with full-size ships and thousands of participants. The historian Suetonius describes a mock naval battle staged by the Emperor Claudius that involved 19,000 men. These were not just games, they were mass executions disguised as entertainment, a testament to the Roman genius for turning death into a breathtaking work of performance art. The role of music in the games is often overlooked. The spectacles were not silent affairs. They were accompanied by a constant soundtrack, played by musicians on horns, trumpets, and water organs. The music would build tension, celebrate a victory, or accompany the solemn parade at the beginning of the day. It helped to shape the emotional response of the crowd, turning the raw violence into a more theatrical and palatable experience. For the fighter, however, the blare of the trumpet might have been the sound of doom, the signal that his time had come, the opening note in the soundtrack to his own potential death. Let's consider another unusual fighter type, the lasso fighter. This was another rare and bizarre class, whose primary weapon was a lasso, which he used to try and ensnare his opponent. If successful, he could choke or trip his foe. Like the net fighter, the lasso fighter was a combatant who relied on a single, tricky weapon and was incredibly vulnerable if that weapon failed. The existence of such specialized and strange fighting styles demonstrates that the Roman audience craved novelty. They didn't just want to see a fight, they wanted to see a unique and memorable performance, and the school owners were constantly inventing new ways to deliver it. The business of betting on fighters was a huge part of the experience for the audience. People would wager large sums of money on the outcomes of the fights. This added a layer of personal investment and excitement for the spectators. It also meant that the fights were subject to corruption. A powerful gambler might try to bribe a school owner or even a fighter to throw a fight. This adds another layer of cynicism to the whole affair. For the fighter, it meant that his life could be decided not just by his skill or the whim of the crowd, but by a backroom deal made to settle a gambling debt. His life was just another chip on the table. The concept of teamwork in the arena is interesting. While many fights were one-on-one, some were group battles, fought in a flock. These were chaotic melees, where teams of fighters would battle each other. This required a different set of skills, an awareness of multiple opponents, the ability to coordinate with your teammates, and the discipline not to get isolated. These group fights would have been incredibly dangerous and confusing, a whirlwind of violence. They also raised the same paradox as the school friendships. The men you trained with as a team one day might be pitted against each other in individual combat the next. Alliances were temporary, and survival was paramount. The fighter's loincloth was often the only piece of clothing he wore. It was a simple garment, but it was also a symbol of his status. It left his body almost entirely exposed, objectifying him for the crowd and emphasizing his physical form. The lack of clothing also served a practical purpose. It made wounds more visible and bloody, enhancing the spectacle for the audience. It was a deliberate choice to present the fighter as a near-naked, primal warrior, stripping him of the trappings of civilized Roman society and marking him as something other, something wild, fit only for the violent world of the arena. Let's consider the world outside the arena. How did ordinary Romans view these fighters? It was a complex mixture of adoration and contempt. They were simultaneously celebrated heroes and reviled outcasts. This paradox is at the heart of the fighter's identity. A Roman citizen might have a lamp with a famous fighter's face on it in his home, but he would never want his son to become one. He would cheer for a fighter in the arena, but would cross the street to avoid him in public. The fighter lived in this strange social limbo, a figure of both fantasy and disgust, loved for his performance but despised for his profession. The end of the games was not a sudden event. It was a slow decline over more than a century. As Christian values took hold, the philosophical justification for the games crumbled. Church fathers wrote passionately against the spectacle, calling it pagan and barbaric. At the same time, The constant wars and economic crises of the late empire made it increasingly difficult to fund the games and procure the necessary men and animals. The final blow came when the city of Rome itself was sacked in the 5th century. The era of massive, state-funded spectacle was over. The great amphitheater fell silent, and the arena fighter passed from reality into legend. Think about the families of these fighters. What happened to them? If a fighter was a captured prisoner of war or a slave, his family was likely lost to him forever. If he was a free volunteer, his family lived with the shame of his profession and the constant fear of his death. A victory in the arena might mean a small purse of money to send home, but it was earned at a terrible risk. The life of a fighter was not just a personal tragedy, it was a tragedy that rippled outwards, affecting wives, children, and parents who were forced to watch their loved one risk everything for the entertainment of strangers. The weapons check before a fight was a crucial ritual. An official would inspect the blades to ensure they were sharp enough to be lethal. This was not a sport with blunted weapons. This was for real. The sharpness of the blade was essential for the show. A clean, deep cut would produce a lot of blood, which is what the crowd wanted to see. A dull blade might just bruise or cause a clumsy, less visually dramatic injury. This small detail is incredibly telling. The very instruments of death were calibrated not for a fair contest, but for the most visually spectacular and gruesome result possible. The very first combat of this type in Rome was not public entertainment. It was part of a funeral ritual in 264 BC. The sons of a dead aristocrat had 3 pairs of slaves fight to the death at their father's tomb. The belief was that the spilled blood would honor the dead man's spirit. Over time, these funeral games became more and more elaborate and moved from private ceremonies to public spectacles. They lost their religious significance and became a form of political theater and mass entertainment. But their origin lies in a dark ritual of human sacrifice, a fact that was never entirely erased from their DNA. Let's consider the language of the arena. The commands shouted by the trainers, the roar of the crowd, the gestures used to signal life or death. It was a whole vocabulary of violence. A fighter had to learn to read the crowd, to understand the referee's signals, and to react instantly to his opponent's moves. It was a high-stakes conversation where a misunderstanding could be fatal. This language was not spoken in words, but in actions, in the angle of a shield, the feint of a sword, and the posture of a body. It was a brutal and eloquent form of communication, understood by everyone from the emperor in his box to the poorest citizen in the top tier. The fighter's body was a canvas on which the story of his life was written. Every scar told a tale of a near miss, a hard-won victory, or a painful recovery. A veteran fighter's body would have been a roadmap of his career. These scars were a source of both pride and shame. They were proof of his survival and his skill, a badge of honor among his fellow fighters. But in the outside world, they were a permanent brand, marking him as a man of violence, a former outcast. He could never truly escape his past, because he wore it on his skin for all to see. The mental game of a fighter was just as important as the physical one. He had to be able to control his fear, to focus his mind, and to anticipate his opponent's strategy. Panic was a death sentence. A moment of hesitation could be fatal. This required immense mental fortitude, a kind of psychological armor that was as important as any helmet or shield. This mental toughness was drilled into them during training, where they were constantly pushed to their breaking point. They learned to compartmentalize their fear and to channel their aggression into controlled, effective violence. It was a brutal form of meditation, a focus born of pure necessity. The concept of a fair fight was largely irrelevant. The matchups were deliberately designed to be unfair, to create a dramatic contest between different fighting styles. The net fighter and the heavy swordsman was a classic example. It was an asymmetrical battle. The goal was not to see which man was the better fighter in a general sense, but to see which specialized style would triumph on that particular day. This was entertainment, not sport. The illusion of a contest was more important than the reality of a fair one. The audience wanted drama, and imbalance creates drama. The fighter's life was a life lived in public. From the parade before the games to the fight itself, he was constantly on display. Even in the school, he was under constant surveillance. This lack of privacy was a tool of control. It prevented any sense of personal autonomy and reinforced the idea that his life was not his own. He was a public figure, but not in the way a politician or a general was. He was a public object, a piece of communal property whose entire existence was for the consumption of others. This constant scrutiny must have been an immense psychological burden, another layer of his dehumanization. What can we learn from the arena fighter today? His story is a cautionary tale about the dark side of entertainment and the danger of dehumanizing others for our own pleasure. It reminds us that behind every spectacle, there are real human beings with their own stories, fears, and hopes. He is not just a cool-looking character from history. He is a symbol of the ultimate exploitation, a man who was forced to die for a living. Remembering his true story is an act of restoring the humanity that his own society tried so hard to take away. So the next time you think of a Roman arena fighter, try to look past the shining armor and the heroic poses. Picture the reality, the fear, the filth, and the futility. He wasn't a hero fighting for freedom in the sunlit arena. He was a prisoner fighting for one more day of life in a dark and brutal system. He was not the star of the show. He was the popcorn. He was the special effect, a temporary, bloody distraction from the routines of Roman life, forgotten as soon as the sand was raked clean, leaving only an echo of a life that was nasty, brutish, and tragically short. Let's consider the physical toll beyond just the scars. A fighter's body would have been a wreck. Even if he survived his fights, he would likely suffer from chronic pain for the rest of his life. Arthritis from years of repetitive stress on his joints, poorly healed fractures that ached with every change in the weather, nerve damage from deep cuts, headaches and cognitive issues from repeated blows to the head, a precursor to the brain injuries we now recognize in modern contact sports. The price of survival was a body that was broken down and aged far beyond its years. Freedom, if it came, was freedom to live in a body that was a constant source of pain. The economics of the fighter trade were complex. A school owner was essentially a venture capitalist investing in a portfolio of high-risk assets. A raw recruit was a cheap initial investment, but most would not survive to become profitable. A star fighter, a veteran, was an incredibly valuable property who could be leased out for enormous sums. This created a perverse incentive. The owner needed his men to fight and win, but he also needed them to not get so damaged that they couldn't fight again. It was a constant balancing act between risk and reward, with the fighter's life and body as the currency being gambled. The idea of a fighting school as a franchise is a useful way to think about it. There were famous schools, like the one in Capua where Spartacus launched his rebellion, which had a reputation for producing high-quality fighters. An owner could build a brand name. A sponsor wanting to put on a top-tier show would seek out fighters from a renowned school, knowing he was getting a well-trained, reliable product. This business-like approach to human combat is one of the most chilling aspects of the whole system. It was organized, rational, and profit-driven, all in the service of providing violent death as a consumer good. Let's think about the moments of quiet in a fighter's life. What did they do when they weren't training or fighting? We have some evidence of simple pastimes. Dice games were popular, a way to gamble for small trinkets or bits of food. They would have cared for their meager equipment, oiling leather straps or sharpening a blade. And they would have talked. They would have shared stories, boasted of past victories, or quietly mourned a fallen comrade. These small moments of normalcy, of human connection, must have been incredibly precious. They were a fragile defense against the overwhelming brutality of their existence, a brief respite before the cycle of training and fighting began again. The role of the referee deserves a closer look. He was often a retired fighter, a man who knew the business inside and out. He was there to enforce the rules of the particular matchup and to ensure a good show. He could step in to separate fighters if they were locked in a stalemate. He could declare a winner If one fighter was clearly disabled but not yet dead, his presence indicates that this was not a lawless brawl, it was a highly regulated performance. But his authority was always secondary to that of the sponsor and the crowd. He was the stage manager, not the director. How did a fighter develop his own personal fighting style? While he was trained in a specific class, like the fish-crested fighter or the net fighter, an intelligent man would learn to adapt and develop his own unique strengths. He might learn he was quicker than his opponents, or that he had superior stamina. He might develop a signature move or a particularly effective defensive technique. This was a matter of survival. The standard training was the foundation, but a fighter who could think for himself, who could innovate and surprise his opponent, was a fighter who was more likely to live. This small spark of individual creativity and intelligence was a form of rebellion against a system that tried to make them interchangeable. The concept of hope in a fighter's life is a powerful and tragic one. What did they hope for? In the short term, they hoped for mercy after a defeat. They hoped for a winnable matchup. They hoped for an injury that was serious enough to keep them out of the arena for a while, but not so serious as to be crippling. And in the long term, they clung to the almost mythical dream of the wooden sword of freedom. Hope was the fuel that kept them going, but it was also a source of potential heartbreak. In a world where the odds were so heavily stacked against them, hope was a dangerous and precious commodity. Let's consider the relationship between these fighters and the Roman military. The army was the source of many arena combatants, as prisoners of war were a prime recruitment pool. The fighting styles of some fighters, like the heavy legionary-style class, were based on the equipment of Roman soldiers. However, the military establishment looked down on arena fighters with contempt. A professional soldier fought for the glory of Rome, for discipline, and for his comrades. A fighter, in their view, fought for the entertainment of a crowd. He was a performer, not a true warrior. This distinction was crucial to the Roman psyche, a way to separate honorable, state-sanctioned violence from the disgraceful violence of the arena. The influence of this form of combat can be seen in Roman art. Mosaics, frescoes, sculptures, and even everyday objects like lamps and pottery are filled with images from the arena. These weren't just decorations. They were a reflection of how deeply embedded the games were in the culture. For a Roman, an image of a net fighter fighting a heavy swordsman was as recognizable as an image of a famous athlete is to us today. This constant visual reinforcement normalized the violence, making it a familiar and accepted part of the social landscape. The art of the fighter is a testament to the popularity of the games, but also a chilling reminder of how completely the spectacle permeated Roman life. Let's reflect on the names of these fighters. Some used their own names, but many were given stage names by their owners. These names were often meant to sound fierce or exotic, like Ferox, fierce, Triumphus, triumph, or names of mythological heroes like Achilles. This was part of the branding process. A good name could help to build a fighter's public persona and make him more memorable to the crowd, but it was also another way of stripping away his real identity. He became the name he was given, a character in a play. His real name, the one given to him by his parents, was often left behind, another casualty of his new life. The logistics of cleaning the arena after a day of games were formidable. The blood-soaked sand had to be dealt with, and the bodies of the dead, both human and animal, had to be removed. A whole crew of slaves and attendants worked behind the scenes to make this happen. Their job was grim and thankless, erasing the evidence of the day's carnage so that the venue would be ready for the next event. This cleanup crew is a forgotten part of the story, but their work was essential to the illusion. They were the ones who allowed the spectacle to appear fresh and new each day, hiding the grim reality of the accumulating death toll. Let's think about the psychology of the crowd. Why did tens of thousands of people gather to watch men kill each other? It's a complex question. Partly it was the thrill of a high-stakes contest. Partly it was a way to feel a sense of communal power, to participate in the life or death decision. and partly it was a safe, controlled way to confront mortality. The violence in the arena was a stark reminder of the fragility of life, but it was happening to someone else. It allowed the spectator to feel the thrill of danger from a position of complete safety. The fighter's real terror was the audience's vicarious entertainment. The celebrity status of some fighters could lead to some strange situations. We have accounts of love potions being made with a fighter's blood, as it was believed to hold great power. The sweat scraped from a fighter's skin was sometimes sold in vials as an aphrodisiac. These bizarre practices show the almost magical aura that surrounded these men. They were seen as being imbued with a primal life force, a vitality that other people wanted to possess. It's another form of objectification, reducing the fighter not just to a body, but to a collection of potent ingredients, a source of magical power to be bottled and sold. The rebellion of Spartacus in 73 BC is the most famous event in the history of these fighters, but it was an extreme outlier. It began when about 70 men escaped from a school in Capua. Their uprising grew into a massive slave army that threatened Rome itself for 2 years. The story of Spartacus has been romanticized as a fight for freedom against an oppressive regime, and it was. But its rarity is what is most telling. The fact that this was the only large-scale successful rebellion to ever emerge from a fighting school shows how effective the system of control was. The constant surveillance, brutal discipline, and psychological manipulation worked. For the vast majority of fighters, escape and rebellion were an impossible dream. Let's consider the impact of the games on Roman society's view of violence. By making brutal, lethal combat a form of popular entertainment, the state desensitized its citizens to suffering and death. It made violence seem normal, even fun. This had to have a coarsening effect on the entire culture. When public execution is a form of mourning entertainment, it changes a society's moral compass. The games were not just a reflection of a violent society. They were an engine that helped to produce and maintain that violence, making it an acceptable and celebrated part of daily life. Imagine being a fighter who receives the wooden sword and walks out of the school a free man. What is the first thing you do? Where do you go? You have no home, no job, and likely no family to return to. The only skills you possess are those of killing. The world outside the school would seem alien and confusing. The freedom you dreamed of for so long would be terrifying in its own way. You would be a stranger in your own country, a man out of time and out of place. The psychological adjustment must have been incredibly difficult, and it's likely that many failed to make it, drifting into crime or poverty. The armor of a fighter was not just protective, it was also incredibly heavy and cumbersome. A helmet like the one worn by a heavy swordsman could weigh over 10 pounds. A large shield could weigh 20 pounds. Fighting in this gear required immense physical strength and stamina. The sheer effort of moving, let alone fighting, would be exhausting. Overheating was a constant danger, especially under the hot Mediterranean sun. A fighter could be defeated not by a weapon, but by simple exhaustion, collapsing under the weight of his own protection. This adds another layer of physical misery to the fighter's experience. Let's think about the different fighting styles as personalities. The net fighter is the cunning trickster, relying on speed and wit. The chaser is the relentless, unstoppable juggernaut. The Greek-style fighter is the disciplined soldier. These were archetypes that the audience could easily recognize and root for or against. The school owner and sponsor were, in essence, casting directors, creating matchups that would provide the most compelling narrative. The fighters were the actors, forced to play their assigned roles in these deadly dramas, with their lives as the price of a bad performance. The fighter's oath, to be burned, to be bound, to be beaten, and to be killed by the sword, is a chilling piece of legal text. It is a complete surrender of bodily autonomy. It essentially reclassifies a human being as an object, a thing that can be subjected to extreme violence without legal consequence. The man who took this oath was legally dead, even while he was still breathing. He had stepped outside the protection of human society and entered a world where the normal rules of law and morality no longer applied to him. It was a contract that signed away his humanity. The end of a fight, when a defeated fighter appealed for mercy, was the moment of ultimate powerlessness. After fighting with all his strength and skill, his fate was completely out of his hands. He would look up from the sand, past his victorious opponent, to the face of the sponsor and the roaring crowd. In that moment, he was reduced to a supplicant, a beggar for his own life. The decision would be based not on justice or compassion, but on the mood of the crowd and the financial calculations of his owner. To have your life hang on such a fickle and arbitrary thread is a terrifying thought. The existence of fighter burial grounds, or cemeteries, gives us some of our most direct and poignant evidence about their lives. At a site in Ephesus, Turkey, archaeologists have studied the remains of dozens of these men. The bones show evidence of healed and unhealed wounds, confirming the violent nature of their lives. Chemical analysis of the bones confirms their diet, high in carbohydrates and calcium. These skeletons are the silent witnesses to the reality of the fighter's existence. They are the physical proof that lies beneath the myth, the hard evidence of the suffering these men endured. Let's consider the possibility of friendships between these fighters. Despite the brutal reality of their profession, it's almost certain that deep bonds were formed. They lived together, trained together, ate together, and faced the same fears together. This shared trauma would have created a powerful sense of camaraderie. We have tombstone inscriptions, where one fighter mourns the death of another, calling him a friend or a brother in arms. These small glimpses of affection are a powerful reminder that even in the most dehumanizing of systems, the human need for connection can survive. These friendships were a small light in a very dark world. The arena fighter was, in many ways, the perfect embodiment of the Roman paradox. Rome was a civilization that produced great law, engineering, and philosophy. It valued order, discipline, and civic duty. And yet, at the heart of its most popular entertainment was a spectacle of chaos, blood, and death. The fighter represents this deep contradiction. He was a product of Roman order, captured by the army, managed by the legal system, trained in a disciplined school, all for the purpose of creating a spectacle of savage violence. He was a symbol of both the height of Roman organizational genius and the depth of its moral failings. The role of social mobility is key to the fighter myth. The idea that a slave could fight his way to freedom is very appealing, and while it was technically possible, it was so statistically improbable that it functioned more as a form of psychological control than as a real opportunity. The slim hope of the wooden sword of freedom was just enough to keep men from falling into complete despair. It gave them a reason to fight hard and to obey the rules. It was a lottery ticket in a game that was rigged from the start, a beautiful lie that helped to sustain a brutal system. Let's consider the specific injuries found on fighter skeletons. We see healed fractures on arms, legs, and ribs. We see skulls with multiple blunt force trauma injuries. We see evidence of sword cuts that were skillfully treated by doctors. But we also see the fatal wounds, the trident holes in a skull, the sword thrusts that severed a spine. These bones tell a story of incredible violence and remarkable resilience. They show us men who were subjected to unbelievable trauma, who were patched up and sent back to fight again, until one day their luck ran out. Each skeleton is a biography written in bone. The atmosphere on the day of the games must have been electric. The city would be in a festive mood. Shops would be closed, and people from all walks of life would stream towards the amphitheater. It was a major social event, a chance to see and be seen. But beneath the festive atmosphere was a dark undercurrent of bloodlust. The crowd came expecting to see violence, and they would be disappointed if they didn't get it. This mix of holiday cheer and morbid anticipation is what made the Roman games so unique and so disturbing. It was a party where the main event was human suffering. The use of condemned criminals in the games is a particularly dark chapter. These men were not trained fighters. They were simply people sentenced to death. They might be forced to fight each other with no armor or training, a chaotic slaughter for the crowd's amusement. Or they might be the victims in the mythological reenactments, where they would be publicly tortured and killed in elaborate ways. This was the rawest form of the games, where the pretense of a contest was stripped away, revealing the core of the spectacle, the theatrical killing of helpless human beings for public entertainment. The fighter's world was incredibly small. For most of his career, his entire existence was confined to the walls of the school and the arena. He would see the same faces every day, walk the same training yard, and sleep in the same small cell. The world outside would become a distant memory. This confinement was a powerful tool of control. It isolated the fighter from society and made the school his entire universe. His hopes, fears, and ambitions were all tied to this small, violent world. Escape was not just physically difficult. It was psychologically difficult to even conceive of a life beyond the walls. The legacy of the arena fighter, in popular culture, is almost a complete inversion of the truth. We have turned a story of slavery and exploitation into a story of heroism and rebellion. We have made the victims into heroes. While this makes for a better movie, it does a great disservice to the real men who lived and died in the arena. Their story is not an inspiring action movie. It is a tragedy. Acknowledging that tragedy is the first step to truly understanding who these fighters were and the brutal world they inhabited. The end of a fighter's career, even if he survived, was not a happy one. He was a man trained for one thing only. What does a 30-year-old retired fighter do? He is likely illiterate, has no trade skills, and is socially ostracized. He has chronic injuries and deep psychological trauma. The freedom offered by the wooden sword was the freedom to be poor, unemployed, and haunted by your past. This grim reality is often ignored in the myths. The story doesn't end with the walk out of the arena. It continues into a life that was likely just as difficult, only without the roar of the crowd. The sand in the arena was more than just a floor covering. It was a stage. It was the liminal space between life and death, where the rules of normal society were suspended. When a fighter stepped onto that sand, he crossed a threshold into another world, a world with its own brutal logic and its own unforgiving laws. The sand absorbed the blood and hid the evidence, allowing the cycle to continue. It was a symbol of the moral vacuum at the heart of the games, a blank canvas that was repeatedly painted with violence and then wiped clean, ready for the next act. Let's consider the perspective of a child in ancient Rome. They played with fighter dolls, they saw their images on household objects, and they went to the games with their parents. They grew up in a world where this form of entertainment was completely normal. This normalization of violence from a young age is a powerful form of cultural conditioning. It taught them that certain people were disposable, that suffering could be a source of pleasure, and that the power of the state included the power to kill for sport. The games were not just entertainment, they were a form of public education. The fighter's diet of beans and barley was not just cheap, it was also a form of social control. A simple, monotonous diet was another way to remind the fighter of his low status. Luxuries like meat and wine were reserved for the free and the wealthy. The food they ate was the food of poverty, the food of slaves. It was a constant, daily reinforcement of their place in the social hierarchy. Even in the act of eating, the fighter could not escape the reality of his enslavement. His body was fueled for performance, but his spirit was starved of the simple pleasures that make life worth living. The sounds and smells of the amphitheater on game day would have been overwhelming. The roar of 50,000 people, the smell of food vendors, wine, sweat, and perfumes, all mixed with the metallic scent of blood drifting up from the arena floor. It was a full sensory assault. For the spectators, it was part of the excitement. For the fighter, waiting in the tunnels below, it was the sound and smell of his own potential doom. The amphitheater was a world unto itself, a seething cauldron of human emotion, from festive joy to bloodthirsty rage, all focused on the small patch of sand in the center. The idea of a good show was paramount. A quick, decisive fight was often considered poor entertainment. The crowd wanted a long, drawn-out struggle, with reversals of fortune, moments of high drama, and plenty of blood. This meant that a fighter was often incentivized not to kill his opponent too quickly. He had to perform, to play to the crowd, to make the fight last. This turned a life-or-death struggle into a piece of theater, where the actors were risking everything to please an audience. The pressure to be not just a fighter but an entertainer must have been immense. The variety of fighter types was a key part of the appeal. It was like a comic book universe of different characters with different powers and weaknesses. The audience would have their favorites and would debate the merits of one type versus another. This created a sense of engagement and expertise among the fans. But for the men themselves, being locked into a specific class was a death sentence. You had to master one set of skills, and if you were pitted against an opponent who was a perfect counter to your style, your chances of survival were slim. You were a piece in a game, and you didn't get to choose which piece you were. The school owner was one of the most reviled figures in Roman society. He was seen as a pimp, a trafficker of human flesh who profited from death and misery. Even though he might become wealthy, he was still considered a social outcast, just like his fighters. He lived on the fringes of society, a necessary but despised part of the entertainment industry. This social stigma is telling. It shows that even in a society that loved the games, the man who managed the bloody business behind the scenes was seen as morally corrupt. Everyone loved the show, but no one respected the producer. The fighter's life was a life without choice. He did not choose his profession, he did not choose his opponent, he did not choose his weapons, he did not choose when he fought. And ultimately, he often did not even choose whether he lived or died. Every critical decision in his life was made by someone else: a magistrate, a school owner, a sponsor, or the crowd. This complete lack of agency is perhaps the most miserable aspect of the fighter's existence. He was a puppet, and his strings were held by a society that saw him as nothing more than a source of amusement. The wooden training sword had a dual meaning. For the trainee, it was an instrument of torture, a heavy, clumsy tool for building muscle through pain. But for the veteran, it was the ultimate symbol of hope. To be awarded the wooden sword was to be given your life back. This single object represented both the profound suffering of the fighter's life and the slim possibility of escaping it. It was the beginning and the end of the journey, the symbol of both enslavement and freedom, a piece of wood that held more meaning than any sword of steel. Let's consider the moments right after a fight. If you survived, whether by victory or by being granted mercy, you would be escorted back to the tunnels. The adrenaline would be pumping. Your body would be screaming in pain from new injuries, and your mind would be reeling from the experience of mortal combat. There would be no quiet moment of reflection. You would be immediately attended by doctors, whose job was to patch you up as quickly as possible. The process was efficient and unsentimental. You were a machine that needed to be repaired for the next performance. The emotional toll was your own private burden to bear. The tombstone of a fighter is a rare and precious thing. Most were disposed of in mass graves, but a few, likely the most famous or those whose comrades pooled their money, received a proper burial and a marker. These tombstones are our most personal connection to these men. They give us their names, their fighting class, the number of fights they survived, and sometimes a short, poignant message. One famous inscription for a fighter named Flama simply lists his record. Fought 34 times, won 21, fought to a draw 9 times, was granted mercy 4 times. It's a stark, simple summary of a life lived on the edge. The idea of a fighter battling for honor is a modern projection. A Roman citizen or soldier fought for honor. A fighter in the arena fought for survival. His goal was not to achieve a state of glory, but to avoid being killed. While a sense of professional pride certainly existed, and a fighter would want to perform well, the driving force was the primal instinct to live another day. The concepts of honor and glory were luxuries that a man fighting for his life in a spectacle of death could not afford. His primary concern was much more basic: to not be the one lying dead on the sand at the end of the match. The psychological technique of dehumanizing the enemy is as old as warfare itself. In the arena, this was done literally. The helmets worn by many fighters erased the individual's face, turning him into a generic, monstrous figure. This made it easier for his opponent to kill him, and easier for the crowd to cheer for his death. It's hard to feel empathy for a faceless monster. The helmet was a tool that served the psychological needs of everyone involved, except for the man wearing it. For him, it was an instrument of isolation and sensory deprivation, a final barrier between himself and the world that was about to kill him. The role of women in the audience of the games is often debated. Some sources suggest that women and men were segregated, with women sitting in the highest, least desirable tiers of the amphitheater. Other sources suggest that at various times, they were allowed to sit with men. Regardless of where they sat, their presence is significant. The games were not an exclusively male pastime. Women were also part of the crowd, participating in the spectacle of violence. This challenges the simplistic notion that an appreciation for this kind of entertainment was purely a feature of Roman masculinity. It was a societal phenomenon that crossed gender lines. The value of a fighter's life can be calculated in purely financial terms. A school owner would buy a slave for a certain price, invest in his training and upkeep, and then lease him out for fights. If the fighter was killed, the sponsor who paid for the games would have to reimburse the owner for the full value of the fighter. This cold calculus is revealing. It shows that the fighter's death was simply a business expense, a line item on a budget. The entire system was underwritten by a set of financial rules that treated human life as a depreciable asset. The fighter's story is ultimately a story about power, the immense power of the Roman state to capture and condemn, the power of the school owner over the bodies of his men, the power of the sponsor to decide fates, the power of the crowd to call for life or death, and at the center of it all, the profound powerlessness of the fighter himself. He was a man trapped in a web of power relations, with no control over his own destiny. His struggle, then, was not just against another man with a sword, but against the entire weight of a social, political, and economic system that was designed to crush him. Let's consider the concept of justice in the Roman world. The arena was a place where a certain kind of Roman justice was performed. For condemned criminals, it was the site of their public execution. For the audience, it was a place where the proper order of things was reinforced. Rome was powerful, its enemies were weak, and disobedience was punished by death. But for the fighter, it was a place devoid of justice. It was a place where skill, luck, and the whims of the powerful determined survival. The arena was not a court of law. It was a theater of cruelty, where the only verdict that mattered was the one that pleased the crowd. The very name of the fighter in their own language came from the short sword used by Roman legionaries. This linguistic link is significant. It ties the spectacle of the arena directly to the military might of Rome. The short sword was the tool that had conquered the world, and in the arena, it was transformed into a tool of entertainment. This appropriation of a military symbol for a bloody spectacle shows how deeply intertwined war and entertainment were in the Roman mind. The skills honed for the battlefield were repackaged and sold as a thrilling show for the masses back home. The memory of a fighter was fleeting. A famous combatant might be remembered for a generation, his name scrawled on a wall or his image pressed into a clay lamp, but most were forgotten almost instantly. Their lives were brief, their deaths unceremonious, and their graves unmarked. They were the disposable celebrities of the ancient world. Their fame was intense, but incredibly short-lived, like a flash of lightning in a dark sky. The system that created them was also designed to erase them, ensuring that the supply of new bodies for the sand was never-ending. The end of the games was not universally celebrated. For centuries, they had been a central part of Roman culture and a source of civic pride. There were surely many traditionalists who lamented their decline, viewing it as a sign of the empire's weakness or a loss of ancient Roman values. The transition to a new Christian morality was not smooth or easy. The slow death of the games was part of the long, painful process of the Roman world transforming into something new, leaving behind one of its most iconic and brutal traditions. Let's imagine the emotional state of a new recruit on his first day in the fighting school. He would be terrified, disoriented, and grieving for the life he had lost. He would be surrounded by hard, muscular men with scarred bodies and grim faces. He would be shown to a tiny, windowless cell that would be his new home. The shock and despair must have been profound. The first step in his training was not to learn how to fight, but to learn how to endure this new reality, to suppress his own feelings of fear and hopelessness, and to accept his new identity as a future combatant. The hierarchy among fighter types is a fascinating aspect. Some classes were considered more prestigious than others. The heavily armored fighters were often seen as being of a higher grade than the more lightly equipped, tricky fighters like the Netman. This hierarchy was reflected in their pay and their place in the processions. This created a kind of internal class system within the already low-status world of the fighter. It was another way of creating division and competition among the men, a tool of control for the school owner to manage his stable of combatants. The fighter's body was a machine, and the school owner and his staff were the mechanics. The diet was the fuel. The training was the calibration. The medical care was the repair work. This mechanistic view of the human body is central to understanding this system. These men were not seen as people with souls, feelings, or rights. They were seen as complex biological machines designed for a single purpose: to perform violence effectively. This objectification was not just a byproduct of the system, it was its fundamental operating principle. The role of the gods was ever present. Before a match, sacrifices might be made to the gods to ensure a good show. The fighters themselves would pray to their own personal deities for protection. The presence of attendants dressed as figures from the underworld shows how closely the games were linked to Roman ideas about death and the afterlife. The arena was a place where the worlds of the living and the dead seemed to meet, a sacred space where mortal combat took on a religious and mythological dimension, making the violence seem more meaningful and profound than a simple brawl. Let's consider the fighter's perspective on the crowd. Did he hate them for their bloodlust? Did he crave their approval? It was likely a complex mix of both. The roar of the crowd could be a terrifying sound, a reminder of the thousands of people who wanted to see him die. But it could also be a source of adrenaline, a wave of energy that he could feed off of during a fight. A fighter who could win the crowd's affection was more likely to be granted mercy. So he had to learn to play to them, to be a performer, to win their hearts even as they called for his blood. It was a deeply twisted relationship. The fall of the Roman Empire was a complex process that took centuries. The end of the arena games was just one small piece of that larger story. But it is a symbolic one. The games were a product of the empire at its peak, wealthy, powerful, and confident. Their decline mirrored the decline of the empire itself, economically strained, politically unstable, and undergoing a profound cultural and religious transformation. The silence of the great Roman amphitheater is the sound of an old world dying and a new one struggling to be born. The Spartacus rebellion, while a failure, left a deep psychological scar on Rome. The idea that slaves, and arena fighters in particular, could organize and challenge the might of the Roman legions was terrifying to the ruling class. In the aftermath, security at the fighting schools was likely tightened, and the level of control and surveillance was increased. The rebellion, meant to achieve freedom, may have ironically resulted in even harsher conditions for the fighters who came after. It was a stark reminder to the Roman elite that the men they were training to kill for sport could, if given the chance, turn their deadly skills against their masters. The fighter's story is a powerful example of how history is often written by the victors. We have no surviving first-hand accounts from these men themselves. Almost everything we know about them was written by the Roman elite, the same people who owned them, watched them fight, and profited from their deaths. This means we are always looking at the fighter through the eyes of his oppressors. We must read between the lines, using archaeology and a critical eye to try and reconstruct the lost voice of the man himself, to tell the story from the perspective of the man on the sand, not the man in the stands. The medical knowledge gained from treating fighter wounds had a lasting impact. Doctors like Galen used their experience in the fighting schools to develop new surgical techniques and a deeper understanding of human anatomy. In a grim irony, the brutal spectacle of the games contributed to the advancement of medical science. The bodies of fighters were, in a sense, living laboratories for the study of trauma. The knowledge gained from patching up these broken men would go on to save the lives of others, including Roman soldiers wounded on the battlefield. It's a stark example of how progress can sometimes emerge from the most barbaric of practices. The allure of the arena fighter myth is timeless because it touches on fundamental themes: life and death, freedom and slavery, individual courage against overwhelming odds. But the real story is a cautionary tale. It warns us about the dangers of dehumanization, the corrupting influence of spectacle, and the ease with which a society can come to accept the unacceptable. The fighter is not a hero to be emulated. He is a victim to be remembered, a symbol of the human cost of entertainment when it is untethered from empathy and morality. Let's focus on the helmet one last time. It was a tool of performance, a symbol of dehumanization, and an instrument of sensory deprivation. But it was also the fighter's final, private space. Inside that dark, hot, and claustrophobic shell, he was alone with his thoughts. It was the place where he had to conquer his own fear before he could even think about conquering his opponent. The battle for the fighter's life began not on the sand, but in the small, dark world inside his own helmet. What happened in that private space, the silent struggle for courage, is a part of the story we can only imagine. The life of a fighter was a life of extreme contrasts. He could be adored by the public one moment and legally worthless the next. He lived in squalor but performed in magnificent arenas. He was a finely tuned athlete whose diet consisted of bland porridge. He was a celebrity who had no rights. It was this constant, jarring dissonance between his public image and his private reality that made his existence so uniquely miserable. He lived in a world of paradox, where fame and degradation, life and death, were inextricably intertwined. The sand of the arena was not always just sand. For special occasions, the ground could be dusted with glittering minerals like mica or cinnabar to make it sparkle in the sun. This is a perfect metaphor for the games themselves. A layer of glittering, spectacular showmanship was spread over a foundation of blood and human misery. The audience saw the sparkle, the dazzling performance, but the fighter stood upon the grit and the grime, knowing the grim reality that the spectacle was designed to hide. He knew that beneath the glitter was a vast and ever-growing graveyard. The fighter's story resonates today because we still live in a world of spectacle. We are still fascinated by celebrity, by risk, and by conflict. While our forms of entertainment are less overtly bloody, the temptation to objectify performers and to consume their stories without considering their humanity is still very much with us. The arena fighter is an extreme example, a ghost from the past who serves as a powerful reminder to look for the human being behind the performance, the reality behind the spectacle. The training was not just physical, it was deeply psychological. A fighter was taught to accept death. He was drilled in the art of dying well, of presenting a stoic and courageous face to his own end. This was a form of brainwashing, a way to make him a more compliant and predictable performer. By training him to accept his own death, the system made him more useful to it. It stripped him of his most basic instinct, the will to live at all costs, and replaced it with a conditional will to live, one that was secondary to the need to put on a good show. The legal framework that allowed the games to exist is a testament to the power of law to define reality. By legally classifying a group of people as disgraced and as property, the Roman state created a category of human beings to whom the normal rules of morality did not apply. This legal fiction made the entire brutal enterprise possible. It was a chilling demonstration that with the stroke of a pen, a government can strip a person of their humanity, making it permissible to treat them in ways that would otherwise be unthinkable. The fighter's suffering began with a legal definition. Let's consider the smell of fear. The tunnels beneath the arena, where the fighters waited, would have been thick with it. It's a primal, animal smell, a mix of sweat and adrenaline. For a fighter, that smell would have been a constant companion, the perfume of his profession. He would smell it on himself, on the men around him. He would taste it in the back of his throat. The ability to function, to fight effectively, in the face of such overwhelming, visceral fear, is a testament to the power of their training and the strength of their will to survive. The variety of exotic animals used in the hunts was a display of the empire's reach. Bringing a rhinoceros or a tiger to Rome was an incredible logistical feat. It was a way for the emperor to say, "My power extends to the ends of the earth. I can command not just men, but nature itself, and bring it here for your amusement." The slaughter of these animals was a symbolic slaughter of the wild, untamed world that Rome had conquered. Each dead animal was another testament to the empire's absolute and all-encompassing power. The fighter's life was a life lived in the shadow of death, but it was also a life lived with an incredible intensity. When every day could be your last, the simple act of being alive takes on a new meaning. The taste of water, the warmth of the sun, a brief moment of camaraderie with a fellow fighter. These small things must have been experienced with a vividness that we can barely imagine. The fighter's story is a tragedy, but it is also a story about what it means to be alive in the most extreme of circumstances, to find small moments of grace in a world designed to crush the human spirit. The end of the fight was a moment of pure theater. The defeated fighter's appeal, the crowd's roar, the sponsor's gesture. It was a highly ritualized piece of drama. This ritual was important because it gave the crowd a sense of participation and power. It made them feel like they were part of the decision. But it was an illusion of power. The final decision often rested with the sponsor, who would weigh the crowd's mood against the financial value of the defeated fighter. The man's life hung in the balance of this complex, cynical calculation, all of it disguised as a moment of public choice. The memory of the arena fighter is a testament to the power of a good story. The romantic, heroic myth is a much more appealing and simpler story than the messy, tragic reality. That's why it has survived and flourished in movies and books. But the real story, the story of the exploited slave, the condemned criminal, the desperate debtor, is a more important one. It's a story that challenges us, that makes us uncomfortable, and that forces us to confront the darker aspects of human history and human nature. Let's think about the weight of history on these men. A prisoner of war, captured from a distant land, would carry the memory of his home, his family, and his freedom. A condemned criminal would carry the weight of his crime and his sentence. A debtor would carry the shame of his failure. They did not enter the fighting school as blank slates. They entered as men with pasts, with histories that had been violently interrupted. The fighter's struggle was not just in the arena, it was a constant internal struggle with the ghosts of the life that had been stolen from him. The fighter's fame was a strange and hollow thing. He was famous for his body, for his skill in violence, but his inner life was completely invisible to the public. He was a surface, a spectacle, not a person. The crowd knew his stage name, but they did not know his thoughts, his fears, his dreams. This disconnect between public image and private reality is the essence of modern celebrity. But for the arena fighter, it was taken to a lethal extreme. He was perhaps the world's first celebrity, and also its most exploited. The Roman amphitheater was a moral universe unto itself. Inside its walls, the normal ethical rules of Roman society were suspended. Killing was not murder, it was performance. Cruelty was not a sin, it was a source of pleasure. This creation of a separate moral space was the key to the game's success. It allowed ordinary citizens to watch and enjoy acts of horrific violence without feeling like they were violating their own moral codes. The arena was a temporary escape from morality itself, a holiday from empathy. The fighter's diet, while monotonous, was carefully considered. The high intake of carbohydrates and beans, supplemented with calcium-rich foods, was designed to build strong bones and a protective layer of fat. The discovery of high levels of certain minerals in fighter bones suggests they consumed a plant-based power drink, perhaps made from wood ash, to help with bone density and recovery. This wasn't about their pleasure, it was a scientific, calculated approach to building a more durable fighting machine. Even their nutrition was another form of control, another way the system managed their bodies for maximum performance and profit. Let's consider the fighter's perspective on his own body. It was his greatest asset and his greatest liability. It was the source of his strength and skill, the tool he used to survive. But it was also the property of another man, a canvas for scars, and the thing that would ultimately fail him. He would have had a complex and intimate relationship with his own physicality, knowing its limits, pushing its boundaries, and constantly fearing its betrayal. His body was both his weapon and his cage. The decline of the games was not just about Christianity and economics. It was also about a changing sense of what constituted entertainment. As the empire evolved, other forms of spectacle, like chariot racing and theater, grew in popularity. The raw, bloody spectacle of the arena games began to seem, perhaps, a bit old-fashioned and barbaric to a later Roman society. Tastes changed. The fighter, once the biggest star in the entertainment world, was slowly replaced by other performers, his place at the center of Roman culture usurped by new and different kinds of shows. The fighter's life was a lottery. Your survival depended on so many factors beyond your control: the luck of the draw on your opponent, the mood of the crowd, the health of the economy, the political ambitions of an emperor. A man could be the most skilled fighter in the world and still be killed by a stroke of bad luck. This constant uncertainty must have been maddening. It made it impossible to plan, to hope, to feel any sense of control over your own life. You were simply a passenger on a violent and unpredictable ride, and your only choice was to hold on as tight as you could. The image of the net fighter casting his net is a powerful one. It represents a different kind of strength, not raw power, but cunning, timing, and skill. He was the thinking man's fighter. But his vulnerability was also profound. If he missed with that one throw, his chances of survival plummeted. His entire fighting style was a single, high-stakes gamble. This makes him a perfect symbol for the fighter's life as a whole. A series of desperate gambles against overwhelming odds, where a single mistake could mean the end. The sounds of the fighting school would have been a constant backdrop to a fighter's life. From dawn till dusk, the air would be filled with the rhythmic thud of wooden swords against the training post, the grunts and shouts of men training, the crack of the trainer's whip, and the clanging of the smith's hammer repairing armor. There was no peace, no silence. The very air was saturated with the sounds of violence. This constant auditory assault was another way the system wore down the individual, leaving him no mental space to escape his reality. The fighter's story is a profound lesson in the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. The system that created the games, the laws, the economics, the architecture, represents a chillingly rational and organized form of cruelty. But the story of the individual fighter, his will to survive, his ability to find moments of camaraderie and hope in the darkest of circumstances, is a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. The fighter's world was a crucible that revealed both the worst and, in a strange way, some of the most powerful aspects of human nature. Let's return to the job application. Imagine being a Roman official tasked with procuring men for the arena. You would look for certain qualities, physical strength, of course, but also a certain kind of temperament. You wouldn't want someone who was too rebellious, but you also needed someone with enough aggression to be a good fighter. It was a cold and calculating process of human resources management, where the job description was to kill and be killed for public amusement. The men who ran this system were not necessarily monsters. They were bureaucrats, managers, and businessmen, a fact that is perhaps even more disturbing. The fighter's life was a life of waiting. Waiting for the next meal, waiting for the next training session, waiting for your name to be called for a fight, waiting for the gate to the arena to open, and ultimately, waiting for either freedom or death. This endless, anxious waiting must have been a form of torture in itself. The brief, frantic moments of combat were punctuated by long periods of monotony and dread. It was a life lived not in the present, but in constant, fearful anticipation of a violent future. The Roman road network was the circulatory system of the empire, and it was also the network that fed the arenas. Fighters, animals, and trainers were constantly being moved from one province to another to meet the demand for games. A fighter might be trained in Italy, fight in Gaul, and then be shipped to North Africa. This constant movement further isolated him from any sense of home or belonging. He was a perpetual traveler, but not a tourist. He was a piece of cargo, a valuable commodity being shipped to the next marketplace of death. The fighter's relationship with pain was unique. Pain was a constant companion, a daily reality in training, and a sharp, terrifying presence in the arena. He had to learn to endure it, to fight through it, and to distinguish between a minor, non-threatening pain and a serious, life-threatening injury. He had to become a connoisseur of his own suffering. This intimate relationship with pain would have fundamentally changed his perception of the world. It would have built a wall of stoicism around him, a necessary defense mechanism against a life that was filled with physical agony. The fall of a famous fighter would have been a major event. Imagine a champion, a man who had survived dozens of fights, finally being defeated. The crowd would be in shock. His death would be a powerful reminder that no one was invincible, that the arena ultimately consumed everyone. It was a public lesson in the inevitability of death. For the other fighters, the fall of a champion would be a devastating blow to morale, a chilling reminder of their own mortality and the futility of their struggle. The arena games were a form of civic religion. They were often held on religious holidays and were integrated into the fabric of Roman spiritual life. They were a way for the community to come together and participate in a shared, ritualized experience. The shedding of blood in the arena was seen, in a way, as a purifying act, a sacrifice that strengthened the community. This blending of entertainment, politics, and religion is what made the games so powerful and so difficult to eradicate. They were not just a show, they were a central pillar of Roman identity. The fighter's story is a mirror. It reflects the values and the contradictions of the society that created him. In his story, we see Rome's obsession with power, its genius for organization, its capacity for brutality, and its deep-seated need for spectacle. To understand the arena fighter is to understand a key aspect of the Roman soul. He is not a footnote in Roman history. He is a central character, and his tragedy is also the tragedy of Rome itself. A story of a great civilization built on a foundation of violence and exploitation. Let's consider the aftermath of Spartacus's rebellion from the Roman perspective. The 2 years that his slave army roamed Italy were a time of terror and humiliation for the Roman Republic. When the rebellion was finally crushed by Marcus Licinius Crassus, the punishment was swift and brutal. 6,000 of Spartacus's captured followers were crucified along the main road leading to Rome. Their bodies were left to hang for months, a terrifying and unmistakable message to any other slave or fighter who might dream of rebellion. The message was, this is what happens when you challenge the power of Rome. The economics of the armor and weapons were also a factor. The more elaborate and protective the armor, the more expensive it was. This is why some fighter types were only lightly armed. It was cheaper. The net fighter, with his net and trident, was a low-cost combatant to equip. This meant that the level of protection a fighter received was often a direct result of a financial calculation made by his owner. The owner was constantly weighing the cost of the equipment against the potential prize money and the fighter's likelihood of survival. It was a business decision that had life-or-death consequences for the man. The fighter's life was a life of profound sensory deprivation and overload. In his cell, it was a world of darkness, silence, and monotony. In the arena, it was a world of blinding sun, deafening noise, and a chaotic whirlwind of movement and color. This constant swing between extremes must have been deeply disorienting. He had to be able to function in both environments, to find a place of mental stillness in the midst of chaos, and to endure long periods of sensory nothingness. This adaptability was another key to his survival. The Roman concept of manly excellence was heavily tied to martial courage. A soldier on the battlefield displayed this virtue. A citizen serving the state displayed this virtue. The arena fighter existed in a gray area. He displayed incredible courage and skill, but he did so in a context that was considered shameful. This created a moral paradox for the Roman audience. They admired his bravery and skill, but they despised his status. The fighter was a walking contradiction of Roman values, a figure who was both courageous and vile at the same time. The fighter's story is a powerful reminder that history is not just about dates, battles, and emperors. It is about the lived experience of ordinary and extraordinary people. By trying to understand the world from the fighter's perspective, by imagining his fear, his pain, and his slim hopes, we can connect with the past on a much deeper, more human level. His story is not just a collection of facts. It is an invitation to empathy, a chance to walk a mile in another man's very dangerous sandals. Let's think about the moments before a fight, in the darkness of the tunnels. A fighter would be going through his own private ritual. He might say a prayer, he might focus on his breathing, he might visualize the fight to come. He would be trying to find that mental state of calm focus that he needed to survive. This was the moment where the fighter was most alone, facing the terrifying reality of what was about to happen. The battle began not when the gate opened, but in these silent, solitary moments of mental preparation. The arena games were a uniquely Roman obsession, but they were also exported to the rest of the empire. As Rome conquered new territories, it brought its culture with it, and that included amphitheaters and fighter contests. This was a form of cultural colonization. The games were a way to Romanize the provinces, to give them a taste of the culture of the capital. It was a way of binding the vast, diverse empire together through a shared, bloody spectacle. The arena was an instrument of both entertainment and imperial policy. A fighter's life was a life without a future. It was impossible to plan for next year or even next month, when you didn't know if you would survive next week. This forced a kind of radical and likely miserable focus on the present moment. The past was a source of pain, and the future was a source of fear. The only thing a fighter truly had was the here and now. This intense, present-focused existence is often romanticized, but in the context of the fighter's life, it was a symptom of his complete lack of control and his bleak prospects. The fighter's story has been used and abused throughout history. In later centuries, he has been held up as a symbol by various groups, as a Christian martyr, as a revolutionary hero, as a paragon of masculine virtue. But these are all projections. They appropriate the fighter's image for their own purposes and ignore the complex and tragic reality of his existence. The real arena fighter was not a symbol. He was a human being, trapped in a brutal system, and his story deserves to be told on its own terms, not as a metaphor for something else. The role of the emperor as the ultimate decider of a fighter's fate in Rome cannot be overstated. With a single gesture, he could save a man's life or condemn him to death. This was the ultimate display of imperial power. It was a way for the emperor to perform his role as the father of his people, showing both mercy and severity. The fighter's life was a prop in this grand piece of political theater, his personal survival, a footnote in the ongoing drama of the emperor's relationship with his subjects. The fighter's story is, in the end, a story about the value of a human life. To the Roman state, to the school owner, and to the crowd, his life had a clear, quantifiable value. It was worth a certain amount of money. It was worth a certain amount of entertainment. The tragedy of the fighter is that this external valuation completely eclipsed his own intrinsic value as a human being. He was a man whose worth was determined by others, and that worth was always secondary to the needs of the spectacle. So we end where we began, with the image of the arena fighter. But now, perhaps the image is different. It is not a hero in shining armor. It is a man who was captured, sold, and imprisoned. A man who was fed on mush and trained to the point of breaking. A man who was dressed in a bizarre costume and sent out to fight for his life while thousands cheered. His story is not one of glory. It is one of the deepest and most profound failures of a society to recognize the humanity in all of its people. The fighter did not suck at his job. The job itself, and the entire world that created it, sucked.